cast your fancy magic someplace else.
Why are the Nords of Skyrim so uneasy about spellcasting?
Disrespect the law, you
Why do the
disrespect
prison
me.
guards in Cidhna Mine and Falkreath take all of your gear when they toss you in prison, but completely neglect to restrain your ability to cast spells? Why is Norse literature awesome? Why is it hard to incorporate directly into a modern video game? And why does ISS start this essay with this barrage of unrelated questions? Well, honestly, that latter is just my attempt at a slightly intriguing introduction, but I'll try to give some explanations in due course. First though, I want to go back to late 2010 when Skyrim had been announced, but not yet released. As an Elder Scrolls addict going back to Morrowind, I was so hyped, because I'd been waiting since Oblivion for the next installment in the series, and as a Scandinavian I was hyped because this installment was going to be about the Nords, and the Nords are, in a way, my people in Tamriel. In case you didn't know, Nord, Nord, is the common modern Scandinavian spelling of its English cognate word north. It's the first element in the name of my country, Norway, the way north, and it also has the same root as the word Norse, which denotes the language and culture of ancient Scandinavia in the Viking era and early Middle Ages. Now, the Nords of Tamriel have always been similar to the Vikings of Europe's north. Already going back to Morrowind, the Nords were portrayed as Viking-like seafarers. They had the northernmost settlement in Morrowind, Dagonfell, on the Sheagorod Islands in the north. Morrowind's expansion, Blood Moon, had also focused on the Nords and used Norse words like Draugr and Scandinavian names like Brynjolfr, Skjoldr, Ulvrun, Bergliot, Rigmor, Thorsten, and Brander. I mean, sometimes they mixed up men's names with women's names, but hey, it's Nords, it's Norse, I was happy. What's more, playing Blood Moon, I had learnt that the Nords believed those Nords who'd proved their mettle in war would spend the afterlife in a hall of valor called Sovngarde. Now this name is clearly composed from two Scandinavian words translating roughly as sleep home, Sovngarde or Sovngård. But more importantly, this whole thing is obviously inspired by the pagan Norse belief in Valhalla, literally the death hall, where the most valiant dead on the battlefield get to spend their afterlife with Odin himself. So, I was really hoping for a game steeped in Norse and Scandinavian inspirations. And then Skyrim was released in 2011, and I loved it, and spoiler warning, Sovngarde was there, and the Draugr were there, and the Norse names were there, and the Viking-style longship at the docks of Lindhelm, and the nobles were called Jarl instead of the English cognates Earl, and I didn't mind that, of course, a lot of it was very, Hollywoodized, like pop culture, Viking Age, rather than actually Norse, like, the silly horned helmets and the fur armor and the architecture, which, is cool, but parts of it seem to resemble the 19th century retro nationalistic dragon-style Dragastil rather than real Viking longhouses. But despite all this, I felt I recognised something a little bit more than that in how the Nords treated magic and a whole supernatural world. I mean, don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying I liked how Skyrim the game particularly catered to spellcasting player characters, especially if you try to rely on this destruction skill line to do damage in Skyrim. Destruction spells are just too similar, too ineffective, and especially on higher difficulty, magic is just in so short supply that no matter how many times I tried to do a mage character, I soon ended up wielding a weapon anyway. It actually took all the way until Skyrim Special Edition came out before I really was able to consistently play a destruction-based character. But there were spell schools I definitely did like and still do. Illusion, Conjuration, and of course some of the shouts in Skyrim were very cool, though for the purposes of this essay I think we really should draw a distinction between the respectable Nord art of shouting and, on the other hand, the act of casting spells, as in the kind of spells you equip instead of a weapon or a shield, an act the Nords tend to regard with suspicion, unlike shouting, which they are in awe of in a completely different way. And in a way, it was this sort of suspicion of spellcasting that I liked. This Nord view of magic as something unsettling and alien, something they'd really prefer not to think about if it could be helped. I mean, obviously Skyrim was far from the first game where magic was distrusted. Dragon Age Origins from 2009 certainly comes to mind here, but in Tamriel, this generally negative view of magic was definitely a trait that helped set Skyrim apart from the settings of the older games in the franchise, like Morrowind or even, Oblivion or Daggerfall, where those settings had like a Mages Guild, for example, in most major settlements, or even several competing organizations for spellcasters. Skyrim has only one small organization based in one place, and that's the College of Winterhold. And this college's relations with the rest of Skyrim is strained at best. Onmund, apparently the only Nord student at this college, remarks that his family thinks his studying there is a death sentence, or worse. And it's all too easy to imagine how this dedication to magic would have made his childhood pretty difficult. Now, this Nord uneasy about spellcasting clearly has an obvious in-game reason. The Nords are warriors. They have racial bonuses to warrior skills, not magic skills, because Nord culture in Skyrim is a warrior culture. Nords value physical prowess and weapon skills, and magic, on the other hand, is associated with foreign peoples like the Bretons and especially the Elven peoples who have been the Nords' enemies, both historically and in the period when Skyrim is actually set in the game. So, in particular, distrust of magic is probably worsened by the fact that magic is the primary source of power for the Nords' most bitter foes, the alien Thalmor, those elven supremacists who have banned the worship of the Nords, a human god, Talos. But Skyrim's few homegrown mages also definitely get their share of the dislike, and as Odmund explains, when that city was decimated by a natural disaster, Winterhold, the mages' college, they got the blame. But, in addition to all these in-game reasons, I'm going to argue that this distrust of magic may actually be inspired by Norse culture, at least in part, although if this is the case, Bethesda certainly tweaked and toned it down quite a lot to fit modern sensibilities about gender and sexual orientation. You see, the Nords, on the whole, they distrust magic, but the Norse, in the past, the real past, they were, on the whole, terrified of magic, or at least Norse men were, because in Norse society, magic was, on the whole, the province of women. The Norse word seidr probably translates better as witchcraft than magic. And Norse poetry, Norse sagas speak of witches and, seeresses, volur, seidkonur. The patron deity apparently was Freya, the goddess of love, femininity, and also magic, witchcraft. But to a Norse man, magic, witchcraft was a threat to your masculinity. It was actually associated with ergi, which was pretty much the worst insult the Norse could possibly think of, because ergi meant effeminacy, unmanliness, and here's why this couldn't and shouldn't be incorporated into a modern game world, at least not without treating it extremely delicately. You see, ergi also denoted the passive form of homosexuality, and that was so base an insult to the Norse that accusing someone of ergi was a legal reason to challenge the accuser to a duel, holmgang. Similar actually to the duel where Ulfric Stormcloak kills High King Torrig before the game Skyrim starts. And by the way, when Skyrim was being hyped up before release back in 2010, the marketers actually promised we'd be able to challenge any NPC in the game to a duel. That's a feature that was clearly abandoned before the game was released, but whatever made them scrap the dueling idea, it's pretty clear why they couldn't steal the Norse view of magic wholesale, because doing so would make the game both very sexist and very homophobic. So instead, the Norse sort of male taboo on magic survived in Skyrim as a sort of skepticism towards magic in general. But wait, you might say, really? Like, wasn't Odin, the king of the gods himself, also a god of magic? Isn't there lots of magic in Norse myths? Now, the Norse Odin, yes, he's definitely male, and yes, although he is also a warrior, what sets him apart among the gods really is his devotion to arcane knowledge. He even sacrifices an eye to gain deeper kind of insight, but here's the thing, not even the king of the gods, the god of the kings, the head of the whole Norse pantheon, not even he is actually immune to those accusations of ergi because of his magic. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this is where I get to draw on evidence from what is probably my all-time favourite Norse poem, the Lokis, in English, Loki's Quarrel, and boy is that a juicy quarrel too. The poem relates how the gods are having a mighty feast, but Loki, the god of mischief, or the trickster demon, he turns the whole thing into a quarrel of epic proportions by proceeding to taunt all the gods in the room one by one. The gods try and throw insults back at him, to try and make him shut up, and the whole thing quickly turns into a sort of full concept rap battle with Loki and different gods taking turns composing stanzas meant to, burn each other in insulting fashion. The trouble is, Loki is a smart talker, and he always has a quick comeback, and so it's the gods who end up being tongue-tied. It all starts with Loki calling the god Bragi a coward, and like the gangster that Loki is, he also treats all the goddesses as hoes. By the way, the Norse word whore means exactly the same as it does in English, and basically all the goddesses are accused of being that. Freya, for example, the goddess of both magic and erotic love, she then calls Loki a big liar, and I'm going to quote Loki's reply in an English translation. He says, "Be silent, Freya, thou foulest witch, and steeped full sore in sin. In the arms of thy brother, the bright gods caught thee, when Freya her wind set free." Now, witchcraft is certainly used in a very pejorative and negative sense here. I mean, Loki goes right from the magic stuff to really painting a picture here. I mean, we've got Freya with her own brother, Game of Thrones style, and then the other gods find her, and then, the goddess of beauty and love and magic in her constellation just lets out a big fat fart. And, to think that people in modern times thought that Life of Brian was blasphemous. And so you'd perhaps expect for Freya to refute this whole accusation, maybe not the fart, but, being found with her own brothers and all, but no. At this point, it's instead the god Njordr who steps in to try and burn Loki, but in turn, he gets burned pretty much himself. And this whole thing is actually 6 stanzas after Odin himself has already been silenced in the quarrel. So how did Loki manage that? Why, by connecting Odin's magic to exactly the kind of unmanliness that I've talked about. Here's the English translation again. They say that with spells, and some say once, like witches with charms didst thou work, and in witches' guise amongst men did thou go, unmanly thy soul must seem. And that last line in the original Norse goes, Okhugdak that args adal, and arg is pretty much the adjective counterpart of the noun ergi, so it more literally Loki says that I find your magic unmanly behaviour. Now clearly Loki knows exactly how to hit everyone where it hurts, and the whole circus continues until Thor shows up and 3 times threatens to crush Loki for his insolence. But it's only after having subjected Thor to 3 stanzas of abuse in response to those threats that Loki finally yields and flees the scene. Now, who would write something like this? The most obvious perhaps answer would be that the poet could be a Christian, maybe even a recent convert, trying to, satirize the old religion in order to expose it as a bunch of dishonorable drivel. And it's certainly possible that the fear and taboo on magic may have got worse when the Norse converted to Christianity, which generally happened over the course of the 11th and maybe 12th century. But it's interesting to note that if the poet was indeed trying to satirize old superstitions in order to root them out once and for all, this wouldn't really work unless this unmanliness of magic was something that even the pagans would find repulsive or at least ridiculous. Otherwise, who cares if some Christian idiot is saying that the magic we like is not manly enough. Now, religious upheaval is certainly at the heart of Skyrim's view of magic as well. After all, we've got those Thalmor who are trying to quell the cult of Talos. Of course, in Skyrim there can be no gender satire of Talos, because men and women in Skyrim are in general much more equal than they were in Norse times. Skyrim's women are equally warriors like the men. NPCs like Lydia and Uthgard and Ayla may well be inspired by the famous shield maidens, but are also attested by some Norse sources. But it bears saying here that even if such shield maidens existed in Norse society, which it isn't entirely certain, they were the exception, really. And but of course, the fact that there are records of them at all is a great excuse to build a world that doesn't instantly alienate women from the game. And it's clear that the developers did think about gender roles when they made female NPCs like Whiterun's Ulfina Greymane comment on the difficulty of being a woman in a society dominated by male values. Despite all this, men and women are in some ways also more equal in Skyrim than they'd been in previous Elder Scrolls games, where male and female characters still had different starting stats, for example. Interestingly, in Morrowind, Nord female started out with 50 in willpower, which is the same as Bretons, even better than the Altmer even, although of course, those races do get much better intelligence and so much higher magicka supply. Male Nords, on the other hand, start out with a measly 30 points in both the spellcasting attributes, willpower and intelligence, so Nord women actually made passable casters in Morrowind. Or casters, or maybe I should say witches, whereas the male Nords would rely on strength and endurance, which are definitely warrior attributes. Now, my point isn't just that Norse society feared magic because it was unfitting for a man. The point is rather that magic was seen as troubling, as strange, as alien, as other. So, just like the Nords, the Old Norse too, they associated magic with foreign peoples. No, not elves, they obviously never existed in real history, although the Norse did believe in Alvar. But there were very real people like the Finns, or the Sami, the native people of northern Scandinavia, who the Norse, they were really worried about magicians among the Finns. So in other words, the Norse views of magic, they express a kind of xenophobia that is also at the heart of the conflicts in Skyrim. I mean the Nords, they feel beset by Thalmor enemies and Forsworn Reachmen and Elven refugees and an empire that many Nords can no longer really recognize. That's the background for Ulfric's rebellion in the Civil War, right? And this brings me to Cidhna Mine and Skyrim's quest called the Forsworn Conspiracy. That quest where the gods take all of your gear and toss you in prison but completely neglect to restrain your ability to cast spells or shout. Now there's a YouTuber called The Closer Look who recently used this as his main example to illustrate what he calls, quote, the terrible problem with Skyrim's magic, unquote. For Mr. Closer Look, the immersion is destroyed by the god's oversight in negating any spellcasting abilities the player might have. The Closer Look's complaint about the quest basically is that it wrecks the internal consistency of Skyrim's world creation because, why don't the gods do anything to try and nullify their prisoners' magical powers before locking them up? He suggests that they could, for example, spice the prisoners' food with magicka inhibiting alchemical concoctions, so why don't they? Now, if this were just any generic high fantasy setting rife with magic, I'd be maybe more inclined to agree with him that this could be just a plot hole caused by developers who wrote a world with magic in it and then promptly forgot that it existed in that world when they wrote this particular quest. But it's not as if Bethesda have never plugged this sort of plot hole about restraining magic users before. In Morrowind, for example, Bethesda specifically fitted the slaves in that game with braces that constantly drained their magicka so they couldn't cast spells. So, did they just get too lazy and too greedy and too generally incompetent to have something like that in Skyrim? I think my day should be obvious what I think, and that is that the reason for this particular design choice in Cidhna Mine is that Skyrim isn't Morrowind, or Oblivion for that matter. To my mind, the gods neglect to counter the magical abilities of prisoners, and that speaks volumes about how many Nords just don't understand magic at all, because they don't want to. So to me, this does really shatter the world building. I go so far as to say that it actually even helps build a coherent world, one that has plenty of magic in it, but also plenty of people who don't want anything to do with it, would rather not think about it. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that the Closer Look's sense of immersion is any less important than my own, and I certainly do not think that you should need special knowledge of Norse culture to enjoy a video game. I definitely think this part of the quest could perhaps do with a bit more exposition, but what surprised me most about seeing this quest as a prime example of Skyrim's bad treatment of magic is that, I remember this as one of my favourite moments using magic in Skyrim. Sure, the sort of adventure we have to make do for a while without all the powerful loot you've acquired, that's an old role-playing game trope, but it's one that I felt worked very well in Skyrim. On my first playthrough as Sneakers, for example, the Khajiit Thief Archer that I've recorded elsewhere on this channel, being thrown back on my natural resources made me appreciate those moderate magical ability that Sneakers had required much more. Like, I suddenly found the Call of Valor shout that I'd picked up in Sovngarde had a real use, for example. I mean, summoning one of the warriors from the Hall of the Afterlife actually made an important difference when I didn't have my weapons and armor to help me out. So I had the opportunity to go back and replay the quest after I'd seen his video as a pure magic user, and again, basically, I had a blast. Now, I could try and list more counter-arguments to those presented by the closer look. One of the most important ones is perhaps that this alchemical solution that he supposes that will really be very, very expensive, and Cidhna Mine is very much run as a business, basically. They use the miners to mine the ore, so they turn a profit. It's certainly not a correctional facility. But I mean, going through a long list of counter-arguments isn't really what I want to do here. I don't really want to make this just a response to the Closer Looks video, partly because, you know, that video does make a lot of valid points, and partly because I'm just more interested in the parallels between Skyrim and Norse culture. And partly because, you know, treating Skyrim as if it was a real place is a bit silly. In short, I guess what I'm saying is simply that I experienced that quest very differently from the way that the Closer Look did, which is, you know, natural, since immersion is almost by definition a subjective experience. And perhaps I'm also trying to point out how in games, like in any art form really, our experience of the work of art is very much coloured by the interests and the background knowledge and the prior experience that you bring to that work of art that you're trying to enjoy. And finally, you know, I'm trying to say basically that Norse literature is awesome, but, you know, basing a modern game on it requires some tweaking. So if this whole foray into Norse literature and Skyrim sparked an interest, first, feel free to leave a comment. For one thing, you know, while I'm no scholar, I still have one or two other favourite Norse texts that I should like to compare to Elder Scrolls if anyone's interested, and if I could possibly find the time. Also, you know, if you're not inclined to wait around for the months and months I usually take to come up with a new video, I can recommend a YouTuber called Jackson Crawford, who is a scholar, a PhD on Norse literature and language. He has lots of good videos, including one on the Lokis. So yeah, that's it. Check those things out, and peace, and live and let live.